Perfect. All righty. We're getting our guests into the room. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Student Success Center presentation of our upcoming conversation called Let's Be Real, Building Inclusive Communities. So starting off today, I'm going to introduce you to today's moderator. We have Desiree Browning, who will be leading our conversation today, who is our coordinator senior who oversees our sophomore coaching program, VIP Suite, and also our transfer program here called VIP Transfer here at the Student Success Center. She is going to be your lovely guide kicking off today, but we do want to make sure that we are dropping today your RSVP link in the chat. So please make sure that you are signing in with that link as you come in the door. Go ahead, Desiree, and take it away.
Hello, hello. Thank you to our panelists for being here. Thank you for all you folks who are tuning in today. We are super excited to have you. Before we get started for our event, we do want to play a little video for you and make sure that we properly do our land acknowledgement. So we will go ahead and start off by playing this video, and then we will continue with our event.
Arizona State University is located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhulkam, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
All right, thank you, Laura, for playing this video. So I want to also make sure that we recognize a couple of important things that are also happening this month. This month is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Now, I do want to point out, typically this is celebrated in May, but since ASU is not in service in May for school, that is why ASU celebrates it in April, so that way we can do so as a community here at ASU. So there are plenty of events that are happening this month. We are super excited just to make sure that you know about this opportunity. Check them out. They are on all 4 campuses as well. And it's not just AAPI American or Heritage Month. We also have, it is Pride Week this week. So today is April 13th, apparently. So make sure you are checking out your Pride Week events as well. Also available on all 4 campus locations. And so there are lots of both virtual and in-person events for both of these things. So make sure that you are checking them out, learn about something new, go and figure out something that maybe is a little bit exciting for you. See what these events are and go ahead and support your ASU community and those other people in the community as well. So I hope you're excited. We're going to start introducing our panelists. So the first panelist that we have for you today is Dr. Brandon Yu. He is an associate professor here at the Tempe campus. And he is also faculty head of Asian Pacific American Studies and the School of Social Transformation and the Sanford School of Social and Family Dynamics at, of course, ASU. He's also an affiliate faculty of counseling and counseling psychology and the Department of Psychology. His background in counseling psychology frames both his research and teaching interests. In particular, he is interested in examining unique racialized risk and resiliency and their impact on the mental health of diverse marginalized communities, including Asian Americans, transracial adoptee, and multiracials. In collaboration with students and colleagues across disciplines, Dr. Yu has published extensively on topics of perceived racism, internalization of the model minority myth, acculturation and enculturation, ethnic and racial identity, ethnic and racial socialization, and measurement development. He has similarly taught and will continue to teach courses related to the mental health issues of racial minorities. Give it up for Dr. Brandon Yu, folks. We also have for you today another amazing speaker who is Dr. Brooke Coley, an assistant professor in engineering at the Polytechnic School for Fulton Engineering. She's also principal investigator of the Shifting Perceptions, Attitudes, and Cultures in Engineering, which is a cool acronym of SPACE, which works to elevate the experiences of marginalized populations, dismantle systemic injustices, and transform the way inclusion is cultivated in engineering through the application of novel approaches in engineering education research. Her active NSF-supported research is focused on 4 pillars: the role of identity-related professional organizations in Black engineering student successes, factors impacting trajectory decisions of engineering students from underrepresented groups at community colleges, creating pathways for engineers to engineering education research, and most recently, an NSF core grant to study the dynamics between Black STEM doctoral students and faculty as it relates to career trajectories and mental health. Dr. Coley also recently received the 2021 Diversity and Inclusion Award from the Fulton School of Engineering for her commitment to creating and fostering a
diverse and inclusive environment.
Thank you. So give it up for Dr. Brooke Coley. We also have Tyler Miller, a former success coach and ASU alum. And if y'all didn't know, she was in the video we played at the beginning. So we are joined by an excellent group of individuals. Tyler is a recent graduate of ASU, receiving her Bachelor's of Art in Art History and her Bachelor's of Science in American Indian Studies. She was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, where she currently resides, and she is a member of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Tyler works full-time for the Santa Cruz Valley National Heritage Area in Southern Arizona as the Marketing and Outreach Coordinator, working to preserve, educate, and celebrate the natural, historical, and cultural heritage for the region. Tyler is currently taking classes for professional development in the Tohono O'odham Community College and is considering getting an associate's in O'odham studies before going to grad school. Give it up for Tyler, folks. We also have for you today Chad Price, who serves as a Director of Operations for ASU's Student Accessibility and Inclusive Learning Services, or SAILS, and has worked in the department in various positions since 1997. He is interested in accessibility and inclusion for students with disabilities and helping the university to be more inclusive in their design and practice of educating all students. He is a certified interpreter and certified transliterator, which I did not know was a thing until he sent in this bio, from the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, holds a Deafblind Interpreting Institute certificate, and is a licensed sign language interpreter in the state of Arizona. Chad has also presented at the AHEAD, Association on Higher Education and Disability Conference, holds a BSc in bioengineering and an MED in higher and post-secondary education from ASU. Give it up for Chad Price, folks. I can hear your imaginary applause. We also have next to you today, DJ Porter, another former success coach and ASU alum. DJ is a multifaceted host, songwriter, rapper, and performer with a large passion for inclusivity and community engagement. During his undergraduate studies at ASU, DJ had his hands in a diverse portfolio of organizations and opportunities that have influenced his outlook not only in his own art and performance, but in the ways artists and the communities that support them engage. Having earned awards in collaboration and mentorship, his work has been noticed by many different artists, scholars, and performers, including Michael Road, Kristen Hunt, and Mary McAvoy. Additionally, DJ has also done academic and practical research and analysis on the presence of the intersectionality of the queer Black experience and hopes to be a living example to undo the erasure of queer identity and African American culture. Creatively, DJ finds himself creating work focused on the validation and celebration of his lived experience as a queer Black individual and wants to continue that journey while also inspiring others to validate and celebrate their agency in
telling their story.
Thank you. I can see 99%. And last but definitely not least, we also have for you Diane Solorio, current ASU student and El Concilio president. Diane is a current senior at ASU pursuing their Bachelor of Arts degree in History, Political Science, and Transborder Chicana, Chicano, and Latino, Latina Studies, U.S. and Mexican Regional Immigration Policy and Economy. They are a student in the Barrett Honors College and the current president of El Concilio, which seeks to unite Latinx, Chicanx, Hispanic student organizations at ASU to represent their interests, needs, and promote awareness of their culture within the ASU community. Diane has held various positions inside and outside of ASU, including teaching assistant, undergraduate research assistant, and legal assistant, which has prepared her to become a leader in the ASU community and beyond. So that is our panelists, folks. I am super excited. We looked for some of the best people that we could find to represent what we wanted to talk about today. And so we hope you are just excited as us to have all of our folks here present. So, panelists, our planned questions come from our Student Success Center, as well as questions submitted in advance by our attendees. We invite you, our people watching, to ask questions in our Q&A feature, and we will review them throughout today's panel. During our panel today, we invite you to utilize also the chat feature to connect and respond. So let's get started with the first question, folks. Are we ready? Are we ready to engage with each other and our fellow people watching? All right, so let's do this. So Merriam-Webster defines a safe space as a place, as on a college campus, intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, or conversations. How have you created safe spaces for yourself and others, and how can our students do the same in their lives as well? Chad, take it away. You even used the raise your hand function.
That was actually an accident, but.
Oh, well, you did great.
But needless to say, I will be happy to respond. From my perspective, so I work with students with disabilities. One of the biggest things that I try to do from looking at how to create a safe space is really just listening. I think most people who have concerns, they just want to be heard. And especially for students with disabilities, often they don't feel like they can be heard. And they need somebody to sit and really listen to what they have to say, because they have things to contribute and things to add that often get dismissed because they may feel like they're labeled, or someone may view them as someone that may not have the ability to do things. And so I think the most important thing that I have tried to do is just listen. Even if I happen to disagree with the person, I think it's important that we still listen, because they're not going to care what I might have to say if I'm showing that I'm not interested in hearing what they have to say. So trying to create that safe space for them is critical for them to, I feel, to help them to really develop in this space that we call university, higher education. And it's just making time to really listen to what they have to say.
Excellent answer. You know, you really touched upon the point of modeling what the safe space you want to receive from others as well, by being able to listen and allowing that other person to also have that same opportunity. Any of our other panelists, what would you also answer to this? Oh, we got hands, physical, and the emoji. DJ, I'm gonna pass it to you first, and then Brandon, we will go to you after that.
Alrighty, thank you, Desiree. So I guess the way I would say how I've kind of created safe spaces for others, I think, which is really interesting, is kind of taking that first kind of reflectionary look inward. Is like, how do I myself need to be supported? And like, because you never know, there are also ways that other people may feel the same way that they need to be supported. So I feel like sometimes having that idea of how can I be supported and what does that look like? What does that feel like? Because having that conversation with yourself might make it easier to have that conversation with others, to be able to have, like Chad was saying, be able to listen to people and also see them and make sure that they are not only represented, but make sure that they are seen and heard from what they need.
Yeah, these are great. The only thing that I wanted to add to that, when I think about, you know, where do I feel in terms of a safe space, and how do I help sort of academically in the work that I do help create safe space, particularly for minoritized community, is, you know, being able to acknowledge the history and the systems of structural inequity that, you know, that our groups experience. And I think part of that for me is then the emphasis, in addition to sort of the safe space in terms of the definition, is but also affirmation. And how do I sort of create affirmation for that sort of safe space and the people that participate? And for me, that starts with, again, as I think DJ pointed out, that inward reflection of being able to understand our complicated identities, even in my own. That, by the way, was one of the best introductions. And Desiree, you're an amazing moderator and getting us, great job. In that presentation, even for me, I think, you know, I think about, you know, some more my important identities, you know, being a 1.5 Korean American immigrant, generation Korean American immigrant, cisgender, straight, and able-bodied, among many others that provide these complicated, minoritized, and privileged perspectives. And so part of that affirmation is just to acknowledge that these biases and systems are there, and that even in my own minoritized voices, that I have privileges that I will be messing up, I will be setting mine, and how, and being able to acknowledge that, I think then provides that space to be able to say there isn't necessarily a right or wrong, but in how we experience, you're valid, you belong. And I think we oftentimes don't have that. And that's why we need the safe space in the first place, right? Thank you.
Dr. Coley, I'm gonna swing it to you.
All right, thank you. And I agree with what Brandon said about your introduction. Thank you for that. I think how I have tried to create a safe space is literally creating space, my lab. And I was really intentional about that because in engineering specifically, we don't tend to address issues of justice, racial equity, inclusion head on. We talk about it and we say we want to be inclusive and those types of things, but actually providing spaces, nurturing spaces, cultivating spaces that afford those opportunities and afford places where students can speak truth to power, and where all you know, valuing everyone's truth equally. They don't readily exist. And so I think in my lab, it creates, we are like family first. We have this environment where when we see things, we speak up and we use them and leverage them as teachable moments. So I think leading by example in terms of, you know, being marginalized in an environment doesn't mean having to withstand these experiences. It means converting these experiences into opportunities for everyone to learn and grow. And a lot of times people feel like, well, that shouldn't be our responsibility, that shouldn't be on our backs, and maybe not, but if not us, then who, right? So it's always one step closer to creating the space that we need. So having space to be affirmed, to be in community, to be empowered, to vent, to share in the solidarity of these experiences is critically important, particularly for students that are navigating these environments where they often are hypervisible and invisible. And so I think the lab gives people footing. It gives them agency. And I feel proud, like in the sense that that feels like a role as a change maker, to help people not only develop professionally or academically or in their scholarship, but in their personal identity, and come out as people really prepared to endure the harshness of this world, and then also serve as leaders to be the change in spaces that's needed.
I think you folks are really touching upon the importance of not just the space when you are in the same room as someone, but also, like Dr. Foley was just saying, creating a physical space that is safe. And what does that look like for each person? So, Tyler, I'm gonna get to you next, but I want to touch upon something that was just said. Dr. Foley, you talked about students who are both hypervisible and invisible at the same time. And for me, that was really powerful. Can you take a moment to just elaborate on that for our folks who are watching right now?
Absolutely. I appreciate you highlighting that, because it is often misconceived and people really don't know exactly what it means. So I'm happy to share at least my understanding in the way that I conceptualize it. In the last, oh gosh, 2 years, it's crazy to think it's been 2 years. We've experienced multiple pandemics. And I say that because often in academic spaces, I only hear about one pandemic. And so when I start talks recently, I ask people, how many pandemics did you experience? And I do it in a poll fashion. So you can see the takeaway is that there's a varied answer, right? Some people 1, 2, or more. And so people's experiences have been really unique and nuanced during these times. And so when you think about hypervisibility and invisibility, what it means is, by nature of representation, you're somewhat invisible because there aren't other people that share in and understand your experiences. For example, thinking about the murder of George Floyd, I went into a meeting the next morning and it was business as usual. For many people in my community, that was a day filled with trauma and grief and sadness, and it prevented many people from being in work mode, right? But that's a part of invisibility. Hypervisibility is because there are so few of you, people are always aware of you and know what you're doing. So it's like, if I don't attend a faculty meeting, now a faculty meeting could have hundreds of faculty there. If I'm not there, people know. Why? Because we have 3 Black faculty in the Fulton Schools of Engineering, at least to my knowledge. So when you're underrepresented, you're essentially, your presence or actions are just over perceived, right? So that's the hypervisibility. But so it's hard to have this constant visibility in terms of people knowing when you're there or not, in terms of presence, but a misunderstanding in your experience, which is the invisibility. And that's what many students, staff, and faculty from marginalized and minoritized groups experience on a daily basis in academic environments.
Thank you. I think that was beautifully stated. Tyler, I want to welcome you to the floor and definitely allow you the space to also answer the question.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to follow that because that was just beautifully worded. And those are really great takeaways. So I definitely appreciate that. On a similar topic of, invisibility, hypervisualization, I think creating a safe space, especially as an Indigenous person, Indigenous people in higher education are almost non-existent. It's one of the smallest populations in higher education. And I think one of the easiest ways as a student I was able to create a safe space was by taking up space. As an Indigenous person, we have certain regalia, earrings, dress that is easily spotted and identify if you're another Indigenous person or if you're familiar with certain cultures. And I think it was being unapologetic in how I decided to dress and accessorize and show my indigeneity physically on the outside, because oftentimes you look around a classroom and I'm the only Indigenous person in a classroom, but when you're walking around campus, you can kind of spot each other. And I think by being and wearing my culture on the outside, it encouraged others to also do that and feel like they're at home, like, oh, okay, I can visibly see other people who look like me and understand my culture and where I come from. So maybe if I also did that, then we can create a safe space in that sense that we know we're not alone in in these spaces, which is what it often seems like.
Yeah, so definitely taking up space is important. Tyler, you were worried about following up. That was an excellent addition. So I want to give you our next question because you folks have kind of been hinting at it, but the concept of intersectionality. There's a lot of identities that somebody can hold at one specific time, and depending on the space you're in, it can impact your experience within that space. So speaking of that intersectional identity, how can we ensure that these inclusive and safe spaces remain safe or are safe for everybody, no matter the race, political stance, gender, or sexuality of the people within that space? This was one of the questions that was also like submitted from somebody who's currently watching. So it's not just me, the people want to know.
Maybe I'll start, I guess. You know, when we're talking about students with disabilities specifically, often a conversation comes up about what kind of language do we use? Do we use person first language, or do we use disability first language, right? So, and it really depends. There's not necessarily a right or wrong, but it depends on the person. So I think the biggest thing when it comes to intersectionality is that we can't make assumptions based on what we see, right? Or we just can't make those assumptions. It's always, and we always recommend just ask, because a person is willing to share, usually is willing to share if you just ask, and ask intentionally, what I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to be sincere about wanting to understand. And so always be okay with asking. One example, and it's not necessarily directly related to intersectionality, but it's related to being willing to speak up. I've seen over the years where a student who is blind is walking down the hallway. Another student sees them, and instead of speaking up and saying, hey, I'm right here, they just kind of squeeze up against the wall and let the student go by without saying anything. And I see this kind of connected to intersectionality is how often do we figuratively just kind of squeeze against the wall and let them go by, versus us speaking up and saying, hey, I really want to understand. Help me understand. Tell me a little bit more. And I think it does go back to what I mentioned originally about listening. We have to be willing to ask the question, but then be willing to listen to the answer as well.
Dan, I want to open the floor to you next. Haven't heard from you, so I'm super excited.
Yes, of course, thank you. And just to kind of go off of that, I think intersectionality, well, of course it's important, but it's also, especially in places such as, for example, us in El Concilio, we really try to make it a mission to focus on intersectionality, because I think ASU this year, they got the Hispanic Serving Institute Award. And so there's a lot of kind of like, there is a pretty sizable Latinx community at ASU, but they do require additional support, and they do require, more resources. And so one of the programming that helped me learn a lot about intersectionality this year was Viva la Drag, which we hosted on November 2nd for our Dia de los Muertos event. And it was like a really cool event. It was like we had local drag performers come in, Candy Muse came, it was cool. But the best part of it was the Q&A session at the end, in which we talked about just the specific struggles that Latinx drag artists face in like the Phoenix, Arizona community, and the overall lack of support they received for, one, not being white, or two, like being Latinx drag artist, you know? And so that really opened up our eyes as a coalition as to like the type of work we need to be doing, because yes, like catering, like our mission is to cater to Latinx students, but a lot of times that's really hyper focused on Mexican American, US citizen students, whereas that's not always like the case in our community. And so it was really like a learning experience for me. And I think that it's important that especially orgs like the coalitions, like they do that type of, I mean, it is a lot of work, but like they do that type, they try to engage in that type of work that explores the intersections between each communities and celebrates them instead of trying to keep them separate as they kind of are in the coalitions.
Brandon, I'm going to open the floor to you next for the tips.
That's a really great question. I think I have a couple of different ideas. I'm not sure if this is going to make sense, but let me see if it does. Let me begin by saying diversity and inclusion does not mean equity, right? So oftentimes when we think about creating sort of safe spaces, everyone sort of feel like, oh, we just need to just include more people and it's safe. And it's just these multiple perspectives allows certain conversation or certain things to be sort of said. And so with that, I think it's important to have a sort of common understanding within these spaces of what do we mean by intersectionality, or how do we define that safe space in the first place, right? Because intersectionality is just not about these our multiple sort of identities or perspectives, but it is, again, Kimberly Crenshaw, and before that, many sort of Black queer activists in particular that sort of shaped how we understand intersectionality in relationship with these multiple system forms of oppression that gives us these different ways of being minoritized and privileged at the same time, right? And if we have that sort of common understanding, I think it, as you know, Crenshaw and others have said, it also allows this opportunity for this great conversation in that safe space to happen. But with the understanding that we're not all here because we all have identical experiences, right? And I think that can sort of conflate into arguments and whatever else and make it feel not safe. So having sort of a common understanding of what intersectionality means, having a very clear ground rules, safe rules, having people, for instance, you know, in our recently with our multicultural student centers, you know, there was issues, you know, having people actually with authority and that could sort of moderate this, right? So that can partly create the institutional space that is sort of ruled by someone who gets this and can sort of control what is or not allowed is very important, I think, in how intersectionality can really shape that we don't make this an umbrella group that everyone has the same experience, but within that, there are very different experiences that we need to acknowledge. There are very different, diverse privileges that we need to sort of contend and struggle with, and what that means and how we translate into actions in that space. So.
I think that was all really well said, acknowledging, you know, there is no umbrella when we talk about topics like this. It doesn't exist. And just because you may have the same identity as one person versus like as the person next to you does not mean your experience is also the same. And acknowledging how that plays into your spaces and how you advocate within those spaces. Dr. Cole, I saw you raised your hand. Thank you guys for using the chat feature. I appreciate you folks, or the hand feature.
Yeah, I just was going to add one thing in the sense that I think one of the most important things that's often overlooked as spaces are created is involving the people that will utilize the space in its design and planning. A lot of times what I'm finding in my research is that these spaces tend to be created for as opposed to built with. And that makes a lot of implications for how the space will actually be experienced, because what you find is what goes into it are a lot of assumptions about the needs of particular people, right? There's assumptions of what people need for gender, or what Black students need, or what LGBTQ plus students need. And these are, or just people, you know, university folks. And so when we do that, we risk the danger of creating a space in the image of what we think those needs are, rather than just going straight to the source. So I feel like one of the things that we don't do enough of is like a a presence in developing things proactively. We tend to create spaces and just think they'll be what's needed. And that's why we often fall short. So that's one thing that I think we could think about in terms of creating spaces that are more reflective and comprehensive and inclusive and supportive of identities and intersectional identities.
Chad, I see you have something you would like to add for this conversation.
Yeah, Dr. Coley mentioned something that just reminded me a little bit of about that concept of something is built for versus built with. When in recent experience I had in working with individuals who are deaf and blind, often things are done for them. But when you actually converse with them, you learn that they want to do that with you versus just be done for them. And they call it co-navigation. And I think that is something I think is critical. What Dr. Coley brought up is how do we create that co-navigation where we're helping one another and learning from each other through that experience. And how do we, when just kind of thinking about this, the idea of intersectionality is how do we really, we don't really know anybody till we take time to get to know them. And how are we going to get to know them unless we actually spend time with them in some way or another? And so it's really doing that co-navigation together where we're learning from and growing with someone else. And I think that makes a huge difference in the overall experience for both people. In my experience working with someone who was deaf and blind, I had no idea that they wanted to do it with me. They wanted to have the experience, but they couldn't experience if I just did everything for them. And so how do we work that out together and learn from each other through those different identities that people have? They're not going to share unless they are comfortable and know me better. And then they're willing to share, and then I get to understand better where those intersections are and who that person is better through the experience.
Thank you all for those excellent answers. We have one from the Q&A that we think is very interesting, and we wanted to address it with you folks here. Do you think that there should be more than just visibility to prove diversity and inclusion of BIPOC and or LGBTQ folks? I see a lot of head shakes, but if anybody wants to elaborate, please feel free. Dr. Coley, take it away.
Yeah, I'll try not to be on my soapbox here because this is now we're tapping into my my realm. Yes, visibility is nothing. I'm teaching a class right now in equities in STEM, and what I'm trying to help students understand is, at least for the last decade, and I'm speaking engineering specifically, we have a lot of awareness of what the experiences are. It's been published, it's not a mystery. What we don't have is accountability for who's responsible for changing those experiences. And so to me, there's an entrepreneurial opportunity there because we have to figure out solutions for this. And the problem is we tend to make, I think, diversity and inclusion to the onus of the individuals that are needing to be included. And it becomes a very siloed problem where this should be a everyone problem, right? It should be all hands on deck, all mindsets, all disciplines. This should be very transdisciplinary and comprehensive. And so that's a great question. Is visibility enough? No, we need action. We need accountability. And there are many realms in which this manifests that we don't even think about. I think typically we tend to process this as like, a lack of diversity and a lack of inclusion is something that happens in the world, or let alone racism. It happens out there, but not in our academic institutions. And it's quite the contrary, right? This is really a breeding ground for, or a test bed for how diversity and equity and inclusiveness really manifests. And we have the opportunity to do that. So I think what we need is more pushing and accountability, metrics for accountability and action. one great example, and I'll stop. The institutional statements, responses that were released after the murder of George Floyd. Many of them gave, promises. They were promises about what would happen. There was acknowledgement about, the devastation. We stand in solidarity with all of these messages. But when it came down to what will be done and who will be responsible, we didn't see that in the statements. That's missing. That's what's needed. So no, visibility of diversity and inclusion, great. We can get more people. We need to change the experience. And that's something that starts with culture. We have to get to culture. And so, yeah, I think accountability is needed.
DJ and Dr. Coley, that was great. You were not on your box. I think you had a great response. DJ, would you like to be next?
Yeah, I fully agree with and want to like re-solidify what Dr. Coley was saying. There needs to be a definite change in the idea of what is the accountability and the action behind these things, because I feel like it really dates back to and really like plays back into the idea what we kind of opened up with, the idea of hypervisibility and invisibility. There's been so many different issues, social issues, different racial issues. We have the literally legislature of like anti-transness going on. We have so many different things that are going on that are very visible, like the visibility of that, the conversations of, gender identity and like having the representation and having these conversations is there. But like Dr. Coley was saying, there's no follow-up. There is no action that is coming behind these conversations. So at the end of the day, it kind of is just like, we're having the conversation to just have the conversation, because where is the work behind it? And I just really agree with like, there needs to be either like a greater, not only conversation, but a greater action and culture, like Dr. Coley was saying, a greater culture built around the idea of how do we do solution-based problem solving? How do we move forward utilizing the kind of addressing what the issue is, but also keeping in mind that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to take one person or one group overnight, and that we just need to continue to keep the idea of like, there is a lot of different intersectionalities and identities that are going to be had in these conversations. There are a lot of different people that are going to be needed to be sit at the table when these conversations and these plans are made, but it has to happen, or else, as we see in, the different social, political, and different pandemics and things that we've seen in the last couple of years, things are just going to continue to be cyclical if we continue to just talk about them rather than do something about them.
I'm definitely hearing from you folks so far. One, the accountability piece, and two, it's not just a one person thing. The whole topic today is how to build inclusive communities, and that can't be a one person job. That has to be an everybody job. Like everybody plays a role in this, and being able to acknowledge the role you have, and also helping other people potentially figure out their own roles and what to do as well. Tyler, I want to go ahead and take you next.
Yeah, I think what has already been mentioned is extremely important. I think it kind of goes back to definitely, if you want to be diverse and inclusive, I think like the goal of a lot of communities is, getting a seat at the table, and you're offered a seat at the table, then that's great. But just because you're given that seat doesn't mean that your voice is heard the same, or that your input is valued the same as other people who are already sitting at that table. I think thinking back to, especially being a student at such a white and Western institution, you want to make sure that you're doing the best for your community, for yourself, that you're represented. But in all of that action that you're trying to do, it's really hard at the student level. So like, that's like the base level. And then you have everyone else that you have to go up the ladder to get your voice heard. And even then, you might not be taken as seriously, or your needs might not be seen the same way from the perspective of like administrative level versus a student level. So if you're wanting to be diverse and inclusive, kind of like what was mentioned before, doing the work with the community you're trying to serve, or the communities you're trying to serve, and not doing something for them on their behalf and assuming that's what the needs are. I think that kind of lost my train of thought, but that like the land acknowledgement video that I was featured in, that statement was written by ASU faculty and administration. It wasn't written by students, even though there was one submitted by students, a group of students that came together and wrote their own acknowledgement to be acknowledged as students, Indigenous students at the institution. But those weren't really heard as, being adequate enough to represent the university. So the university had their own statement, and that one was what was filmed. So it's things like that, actions like that, that you want to push forward because it represents you, represents the community you're trying to represent. And yeah, visibility is not enough. Just because you play that video at the beginning, it doesn't really mean anything unless you're going to take it a step further. You're going to continue educating and continue the actions related to that. A 2-minute video isn't the solution.
Thank you for sharing that. Also, it's a fact I didn't know, so thank you. I'm learning lots of new things today, so I appreciate that. Diane, go ahead and take the floor next.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that visibility is enough. And I also think that like the coalitions are like a perfect example of that, because everyone knows about them, everyone hears about them, but like they're like, not everyone that works in coalitions are paid. So like, for example, that's something that like has been being pushed for since like even before I started like getting involved, which is like my sophomore year, and like I'm a senior right now. I know Tyler worked on this too when she was in AIP, and every year we have the same conversation where we ask administration if all of our directors can be paid, because for other organizations such as like USG and PAB, all of their directors are paid. And so for the coalitions, we're like, they're supposed to give us a stipend for 2 people, but we split that up. So like this year, ELCO, we split it up in between 5 people, and it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And I think institutions as big as ASU, like they definitely put their money where their values are at. And so if they don't have, or if they are unwilling to pay the students whose work they like promoting, whose work they like sharing as like the like, oh, look at how diverse ASU is, then they truly don't care about it, especially because I feel like most of the students that work in the coalitions are first generation. Many of us are low income. Many of us have already multiple jobs, and we're taking our time to like sit in these meetings with ASU, plan these events because we care about our community. And we're very exploited. And it's not just like an ELCO thing, like all of the coalitions feel this way and have felt this way for years. And so definitely like diversity and visibility, like yes, it's one aspect where we like having the space, we like having the ELCO office to go to, we like talking about the multicultural space, but at the end of the day, it's exploitative because we're not being paid for any of our efforts. So yeah.
Thank you. Getting snaps from Tyler, snaps from DJ. You've got lots of head nods along the way. Thank you for sharing that. I hope you folks are taking away things from this conversation right now. The next question that I have for you folks, part of building these inclusive communities and being able to have, basically it's not, just one person working on it. There is the concept of being an ally. So I want to hear from you folks. How would you define being an ally, and how do you incorporate that into your daily life? Brandon, take it away.
I can go, but I can go after. I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I can go after somebody else. I think somebody else raised their hand. Is it Diane? Did you want me to go?
Yeah, I think you've got the floor. I think you're good.
For me, ally means many things. And again, I think this is just the scientist in me. Like I think about what and how we define ally and allyship. And I've always had a problem with it. I just personally felt really uncomfortable with the term. And I think over the years, I've been able to identify there are many problems with it. For me, like ally is a noun and not a verb. It is something who you are rather than how you sort of constantly carry the actions to what is an ally, which is right to be able to sort of support or facilitate or aid in a for an effort of a minoritized group that is not a shared experience. And so I've always felt kind of uncomfortable with it as a noun and not a verb. I've always been uncomfortable with it in terms of I can support this community that I don't participate in, this minority group, the Asian group, the Black group, or whatever else. And it feels very distal in terms of like, if I do anything, or if I even just express my support for Black Lives Matter, that is enough, that I'm being an ally. And as we've sort of talked about before, as we think about the creative spaces, it requires more than that in terms of just support, right? There is, the term ally for me ignores history, structure, institutional structures, and more importantly, privileges that, again, become invisible in that narrative of what it means to be an ally. I think there's been a lot of writings in terms of like, one that I like better is a co-conspirator. This idea that not only in terms of my identity, but on a daily basis, there are privileges I take as a male, cisgender, straight, able-bodied, in addition to being a minority. So what that means and how that translates to be a co-conspirator is to reflect on those privileges on a regular basis and constantly mess up. And I tell you this, I mess up a lot, but I do that with the earnest intent of acknowledging that there is this longer history of why I mess up. I haven't got the education or the experience that allow me, right? Because we live in a certain space that is biased. And so, how then that translate into the things that I advocate for our faculty meetings, my teaching, and how I share my identities or the curriculum and the different perspectives and voices within these different communities that I may be privileged to not care about or have to sort of think about. And in my research, in my lab, and that's sort of how you sort of kind of carry that out every day, is to figure out who's invisible in these voices and perspectives that we're constantly sort of being experts in, and how do we get them in this space?
I like that you touched upon the fact too, it's okay to make mistakes. You don't have to be perfect at this. You can make the mistakes, learn from it, and maybe we don't know how to be the perfect co-conspirator yet, because we just don't know yet, because it's an ever-evolving experience. DJ, I want to go ahead and take you next, and then Chad, I see you, but I got one more question that hopefully you can answer, because believe it or not, folks, this hour is almost up. I could sit here all day and have this conversation, but I want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time here. So DJ, go ahead and follow up with Brandon.
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep mine a little bit more on the succinct side. Everything that Brandon was saying was very, very, very powerful. I resonated with a lot of it. And I know this is the exact question is kind of how we define allyship. Something I think really I wanted to kind of share was a couple things that allyship is not. And allyship is not temporary. Allyship is not self-sufficient. Allyship does not end when you get uncomfortable or when the going gets tough. Allyship is a continued endeavor on your part. And we all said, like we said, it's not an individual thing, but you still have, everyone has their own weight when it comes down to it. And I just feel as if like allyship, especially like kind of speaking on like just like one of my own experiences, it's like being a queer and African-American individual, it's like easily on both sides, you see that there's like people who for the convenience and the virtue signaling, people throwing up Black Lives Matter, saying I'm a supporter, or oh, I support and I'm not against, the violence that's happening against Black people, but I won't be going to a rally. I won't be, posting links to help like people's funds and different things like that. Or on the flip side of the coin, like I said, being a queer individual, oh, I'm okay with with queer people having pride and things like that, but I don't want my kids seeing queer identities or queer people on TV or in movies and things like that. That representation should not be in the mass public eye and things like that. And so I just kind of wanted to, like, I guess, draw a little bit of the line in the sand that like allyship is a continued 24/7, 25/8 kind of thing. That allyship doesn't stop when you get home, when you put down your phone and log out of your Instagram or anything like that. Allyship is a continued endeavor that I feel like even if it's not in your everyday life. I feel like it's something you should think about as like, because like Brandon said, you know, it's okay to make mistakes, but continue to how can you learn from those mistakes and how can you continue to be a better person as we endeavor to be better co-conspirators rather than allies. And that's all I wanted to say.
I think that was a great follow, DJ. Like I said, Chad, I see you, but I want to hit, you know, our last question, just to make sure we're able to kind of cover our bases. It is our last question that is in our Q&A. And so the question that we have for you folks is, how do we approach these topics with well-meaning allies or co-conspirators who maybe don't understand these structural inequities?
So I'll go ahead and maybe speak to that, and that's kind of what I was thinking with the comments, that hopefully this is along those same lines of addressing that question. In sign language, the sign for connect is connecting the hands together, so you're making a connection. And so I think one way to do that is you make a connection. There's a quote from President Lincoln who essentially said, "I don't like that man, I need to get to know him." And so I think the way you navigate it is you get to know the person who is wanting to be an ally, just doesn't understand. You make a connection, you get to know them, so then you can help them navigate and understand what it means to really to navigate these subjects and these topics. And you know, if they're well-meaning, that means they have a desire to do something and to do good. And if they have that desire, then they're willing to listen and to learn. And so, and they're going to be open to hearing what you have to say and the things that you're trying to explain, because that's what if they've got a willingness, then they're going to be willing to make some changes and adjustments from what you have to offer. And so I just make those connections and help them to understand what they really need to understand. It's going to be best and it's going to benefit everyone through that experience.
Tyler, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think that you have to do a lot of internal work on yourself before you can fully commit to doing this type of work and having these type of conversations, because whether you know it or not, everyone has internal biases. They have stereotypes in their heads, and you can't come to these conversations without recognizing that you're going to have opinions and thoughts on things that other people won't agree with, and that you have to be okay with that and be open to those conversations. So I think that the work starts internally with whatever you think. It kind of goes back to the intersectionality. You don't know everyone else's experiences, and if you're not willing to be open to those experiences, then you can't continue the work. You can't continue the conversation honestly and with integrity if you don't start that internal work on yourself.
Brandon, I'm going to go ahead and let you close this question out, and then we'll unfortunately have to wrap up. But Brandon, go ahead and take it away.
I hate to be the last person. I was just thinking that, and it depends on the question from what and whose perspective, but I think we need to acknowledge that being a minoritized person in academia or any other sort of professional institutional space is oftentimes quite exhausting. You hit racial battle fatigue, for instance, is a very real thing. The lack of compensation, the additional service that's not sort of recognized, the disproportionate disparities of women of color not getting certain services throughout. These are very real things, and it becomes very overwhelming. I think sometimes, you know, when we try to think about how do we engage with people who don't get these things, we have this earnest intent and we have a script and we try to be careful, but sometimes I wonder whose labor is that and whose job is it? And I find myself maybe more recently lately where if you don't know, I'm not going to engage you in the conversation because I'm too exhausted and tired to teach you. And to be honest, it's not my job to teach you. It's your job to go learn about the history of how I've been minoritized in this perspective. And more importantly, what are you doing to help create space for me to help participate in that, you know, and for others to help me participate in that, right? so there is this sort of line in terms of, I think, from that perspective, we feel like it's a right thing and we always have to teach everybody. But I think, you know, as minoritized folks and students, you need to be quite thoughtful about your energy and how you want to spend it. You can't change the world and you're not going to have the energy to do so. So think about, with my students, the issues about being minoritized and disparities is structural. And so unless we have a relationship and engagement with the structures, there's no change. We could have a conversation all day long and nothing's going to change. And so thinking about, if you're going to waste the time and energy to change or have them understand your intersectional perspective, the minority perspective, how can you have that or invest that energy into people or things that are worth your time and while? Because you can't do it with everybody.
And I think that was a great note to end off on, folks. Wow, this was a great conversation. I hope even if our panelists, if you've learned something today, if our folks watching learned something today, like I said, we could talk about this all day. If we had much more time, we would, but we only asked our panelists for an hour. So I definitely appreciate your time, your commitment to be here, the commitment to be real and have these conversations that people should hear and should listen to and participate in. Thank you for doing all of this today. Your passion, strength, and words of confidence have hopefully left an impact on our attendees here. As we close, we have a few housekeeping items for you folks. So this event is part of our VIP Student Success Series coaching workshops from the Student Success Center. Hi, we're from the Student Success Center. And we invite you to give us your feedback, your honest feedback. After the conclusion of this event, you will be sent a survey asking for your opinions. We would greatly appreciate for you to share your honesty with us about this event and any future events that we may host. If you sat here and you're like, wow, I wish this event was an hour and a half, put that down. We want to know about it. So whatever feedback you have for us today. Trinice, did you have something to add?
Please make sure that you have signed in as well. We did drop the link in the chat for you when you were coming in. That please make sure that you signed in, that you attended this event.
Thank you, Lauren. Again, we want to encourage you to continue the celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Month, as well as Pride Week events happening across the university. We'll provide that link for you again so that you can see what remains for the final 2 weeks of April. We also want to encourage all in our audience today to find more events like this and other opportunities to connect with the Student Success Center. It's not too late to meet with your success coach. Hint, hint, wink, wink. And our coaches would definitely love to meet with you before the semester wraps up. You can find all of our events online via Send Up a Sync, get connected to our center and other students by visiting our Slack channel, our website to book an appointment, and our other resources. And of course, follow us on social media. We highlighted a panelist a day leading up to this event. So if you missed out on it, woo, they have impressive resumes. So definitely feel free to check out any and all of our social media. And like I said, we are just super excited to have you with us. Thank you again for our panelists for attending. I have to sit and compress all of this information and really dive into that. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all of our folks who came in today and watched our discussion. Have a great day, folks. Thank you so much.